Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What creepy and haunting experience stays with you to this day? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was young, maybe 10 or 11, and home alone after school. I was working on my homework upstairs when someone rang the doorbell. Sometimes my friend down the street would come over, so I ran downstairs thinking it was her. There was a window above our door, and it was very high up, so usually I could stand at the top of the stairs and look through it to see who was at the door at the top of their head. This time, there was a man just looking through that window. It must have been 7 feet off the ground, and he was eyeline with it. He had a very round face, I remember, and a huge smile. It was something out of a horror movie. Then my cat, whom I regularly call Slutty because he is so friendly, lol, starts growling at him. My kitten was on the landing with me. He sees me at the top of the stair landing and just says, "Hi, I'm here to check for pests. Can you let me in?" I duck down and he says, "I saw you. I know your parents aren't home, but I need to come in." I still hear his voice clearly. I was terrified and ran down the stairs and into the kitchen to grab a phone. He keeps asking me to open the door. Finally, I tell him something like, "No, you'll have to come back another time." He won't take no for an answer. He just keeps repeating himself. Then I tell him I'm going to call the police. All politeness out the window. Says something about me being rude and that I'm stopping him from doing his job. I keep repeating that I will call the police, and he finally starts just screaming and cursing at me, and finally he slams his hand as hard as he can into the door. I start dialing and he runs off, calling me a bitch. I don't finish calling the police and sit near the front door until my parents come home. I didn't even know what bitch meant. I didn't tell them because I thought I'd get in trouble. Definitely not as scary as others here, but I remember it so clearly. His weird smile, his head was perfectly round, and how he was so tall. I was really short as a kid. When I was a kid in elementary school, I had one best friend, we'll call him Jim. We were pretty much inseparable and spent a ton of time at each other's houses. I loved when he came to my house. We'd play in my giant sandbox, or with my train set downstairs, or build snow forts in the winter. It was a blast. I wasn't as thrilled to go to his house, however. His mom was an absolute angel, soft-spoken, incredibly kind, and she often took us to fun places, water parks, toy stores, museums, etc. They even had a pool. What made me apprehensive was his dad. He was a complete 180 from Jim's mom. Really tall, well over 6 feet, perpetually grumpy, and had a booming bass voice that you could feel in the air when he spoke. He intimidated the living shit out of all the neighborhood kids that came over to Jim's house, including me. A good example of his ability to instill maximum fear simply by existing, I'd be over at Jim's house, walking down the hall to use their bathroom, and his dad would appear, coming from the opposite direction. He loomed over me like a giant, so I usually did my best to cower and try to be invisible as he went by. On more than one occasion, just as I was about to pass him, he spun on me and got right in my face, yelling, "What are you doing?" I'd stammer out that I had intended to use the bathroom, but no longer needed to since I'd pissed my pants. He'd straighten back up and continue walking, laughing to himself as he went. In hindsight, I think he knew he scared the hell out of us and enjoyed it. That being the case, I quickly learned to recognize the sound of his truck when he came home. I'd run to Jim's room and wouldn't come out until it was time to go home. The other thing that was scary as hell, Jim's dad and mom got into loud arguments all the time. I have to give her credit. Jim's mom would get right back in his face and not back down an inch. Still, anytime we'd hear them shouting from the other room, we both worried that we'd get it from Jim's dad for some unknown reason. To the best of my knowledge, nothing ever became physical, but, oh man, the racket they made when they'd go at each other. Once during the summer, when we were all playing around in the pool, he approached me from behind, lifted me up, and tossed me into the deep end of the pool. I couldn't swim. I thrashed around wildly. I was about to drown when Jim's mom dove in and pulled me out, giving her husband a nasty look. He just laughed to himself and wandered off. One winter day, Jim and I and his sister were out sledding in the backyard, and the zipper of my snowsuit came off the track. I went inside, and Jim's mom, who told me his dad would fix it. I tried to say, no, it's okay, but she was already calling down the stairs to him. The booming response from the basement, "Send him down." I went down the stairs as if I were living my final moments, all shaky and scared. There were almost no lights in the basement, just a single bulb hanging from a string in the workroom where he was located. "Come here," he boomed. I nervously stepped over, and he bent on one knee to take a look at the zipper. Even then, he was still 3 feet taller than I was. He stood and walked over to his bench, returning with a pair of needle-nose pliers. He put the wayward zipper back on its track, then bent so he was almost nose to nose with me. I was petrified. He took the pair of pliers, opened them up, and placed them on my nose, then gave them a little bit of pressure. Just enough to where it almost hurt, but not quite. Then he removed them, stood and chuckled like he always did. I must have done 140 miles per hour running up the stairs and back outside. As a little kid, I'd never been more terrified. Fast forward to age 15 or 16, my folks and I had long since moved out of the area, and Jim and I hadn't spoken since about 4th grade. My parents informed me that Jim's dad had been put on the predator list for having underage child content on his home computer. They asked me if anything funny had ever happened during my time at Jim's house as a kid. I immediately recalled the nose plier situation, and a chill went up my spine like you wouldn't believe. Thankfully, I wasn't a victim, but my blood ran cold when they told me that. I mean, the guy sounded like a creep to begin with. You shouldn't do that and scare kids and then laugh about it. So, disappointing and horrible, but I guess based on the description of the events, sadly not surprising. Ugh, terrible. So I used to go out clubbing with my friends often. Many times we'd take a drive to far out city for the night or weekend. Anyway, we'd been planning to go to a specific city on an upcoming weekend, which neither myself nor my friend had ever been to before. It was a city about 4 hours drive away, and not someplace you'd associate with us traveling to. So in the week leading up to the trip, all plans were in motion. During the week, I was visited by my dad and mom at the family home, and my dad, in all seriousness, tells me at the dining table about a dream he had, in which he had been called by the police of the city I'm traveling to on that weekend, saying that I died in a crash. It was obvious that he'd been affected by this dream, as never ever has he mentioned anything like this before or expressed any fear for my personal safety. He is a pretty stoic person who isn't given to sentiment easily. Now, please bear in mind that I'd not mentioned to my dad about my upcoming travels, and there's absolutely no way he would have found out from anyone else. When he told me this story, I didn't say much other than something like, "Okay, that's a weird dream." I didn't tell him about my planned travels, but inside I was shook up by the coincidence, so much that I canceled my trip and vowed never to visit the city, just in case death is waiting for me there in some final destination type of way. I was in a movie theater with my grandma as a little kid, like 10 years old, and we were in the back row, and halfway through the movie, this random guy sits 1 seat away from it. And I have this really vivid memory of him walking his fingers, like when you pretend your fingers are legs, I don't know how else to describe it, across the folded seat between us while grinning at me. And I was just kind of weirded out and scooted closer to my grandma. And then I got distracted by the movie, and the next time I look over, he was gone. It's such a bizarre memory. It is a hard time believing it happened, but I remember it so clearly. Even what movie it was, and that everything happened afterwards, still creeps me out. I was walking home from middle school, probably aged 12 to 13. I lived in a pretty small town, and for quite a bit of the walk home was the grassy side of this tiny main road that ran out of town toward my house. As I was approaching a train crossing, I heard a car coming up the road toward me from behind. I had to reason to believe it was any different than any other car that had passed me by. But something made me turn around and look. there was an old Buick driving through the grass, directly towards me, with the driver white-knuckling the wheel and staring at me with this level of hate on his face I'd never seen before or since. I managed to jump out of the way into the nearby field, and the car swerved back onto the road and drove off. If I had been somebody not paying attention, that'd been one thing. But this dude was absolutely gunning for me, and I have no clue who he was or why it happened. It's been almost 30 years, and hearing a car approaching from behind still gets me on edge. One night I was up reading when my radio turned on full volume without me touching it. I turned it off and fell asleep without much thought. The middle of the night I woke up to the abrupt sound of my radio turning on again and shuffling channels. I unplugged the radio and quickly felt uneasy about how it happened. I then began to have an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched, so I hid under the blankets like a typical middle schooler. There was then a faint tapping on my bedroom window, which basically had me in full-scale flight or fright mode. When I looked out the window, it was completely fogged over except for the mountains outside. I ran to my sister's room and was like, bat out of hell, I begged to sleep next to her that night. A few days later, I came home from school to a bunch of cops outside my neighbor's house. It turns out the guy next door was cutting down a tree, and when he fell off his ladder, fell into his axe. His son found him days later, when no one could get a hold of him. His body was a few feet away from my bedroom window. I put my house up for sale, and my kids and I moved into a rental in a nearby town. The rent is cheap for this area, but this house needed some work. My landlord is the sweetest old lady, and she told me she couldn't rent to me in good conscience without telling me about her son dying in the house. She didn't want me to hear it from the nosy neighbor and be upset. He was an adult who had severe mental disability and schizophrenia and couldn't function on his own, so he lived with her and her husband. One night he repeatedly stabbed himself with a kitchen knife while they were sleeping. No one knows why. My landlord found him in the morning after, but it was too late. It happened several years ago, but still, I wasn't crazy about living here. In the end, I did take it due to the lack of options. I'm newly divorced and broke. My toddler has a genetic disorder that affects his motor skills, and he was nonverbal because of that. But he's recently developed some speech and uses basic words. He's just now getting around to the baby talk phase most kids go through in their first year or so. So he couldn't really communicate to me why he'd been trying to talk to the wall in a certain corner of the sunroom. There was nothing remarkable about it, but he would stand there for an hour or more and babble away, if you let him. I watched him do it many times, and it was like he was really talking to someone. Kids do weird things sometimes, so I figured maybe it was an imaginary friend or something like that. I was up before dawn doing some work on my laptop a couple of weeks ago, and he was the only person up with me. He went in the sunroom, and pretty soon I heard wild giggling coming from in there, so I got up to check on him. Usually that kind of laughter means he's having fun doing something he knows he isn't supposed to. He was standing in the corner, and the way he was acting, it looked like he was just being tickled by something. He was laughing to the point he could hardly breathe when I followed him away. He immediately cried and came to me for hugs, which made me think he definitely wasn't enjoying that interaction, whatever it was. That was the first time I considered something paranormal might be happening there. It hasn't happened again, but he also lost interest in the corners and doesn't go near it. I'm trying to convince myself that I'm being silly, and I'm just anxious over my life being uprooted and moving into a house that someone died and not peacefully in, but no. These Native Americans, this house is seriously creepy. As soon as my house is sold, we are out of here. 4 times in my life I've had dreams that I can only describe as premonitions. I'm a skeptic, and I still like to mostly believe that what I've experienced is pure coincidence. Otherwise, it creeps me out too much. These dreams are hyper-realistic and very specific. Usually, I wake up from them with an intense need to immediately puke. The first one I had, I saw my good friend hanging out with some friends of his. They were planning to go to a party and decided to carpool. He gets into the back seat of a blue four-door sedan just behind the passenger. The car gets into a terrible accident, and he's ejected from the car as he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He dies on the side of the road before first responders can get to him. I woke up, barely made it to the bathroom, and my whole body was shaking. I didn't want to call him and felt like a complete idiot, even thinking of calling him, but couldn't shake the feeling this was about to happen. So I call him, tell him the details, and ask that if he goes out that night, please wear a seatbelt. He confirmed they were going to a club that night, but otherwise laughed it off and was like, whatever, bro. About an hour later, he calls me hysterical, crying and repeating that I saved his life. When he calmed down, he said that soon after the call, his friend pulled to pick him up. One had a brand new blue Honda Civic that they motioned for him to jump into. He felt stupid, but he told them he'd actually go in the other friend's car. On the way to the club, while crossing a busy intersection, someone blew a red light and T-boned the Civic, dead on the back passenger side. The car was totaled. The driver and passengers survived, but with serious injuries they still deal with today. Again, I want to believe it was just coincidence, but I've had a few more coincidental dreams like this, and it seriously freaks me out when it happens.